October 24th, 1944. The Formosa Strait, 25 miles east of Turnabout Island. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane gripped the periscope handles as he watched something that would define the cruelest irony in submarine warfare. Through the crosshairs, a Japanese transport convoy lay exposed, crippled vessels listing in the water, their escorts scattered and ineffective. It was the perfect ending to what had been USS Tang's most successful patrol, a run that had already sent 13 enemy ships to the bottom. The submarine's torpedo tubes had fired relentlessly for 5 days. From Formosa to the Chinese coast, Tang had hunted with unprecedented aggression, slipping through destroyer screens, attacking from impossible positions, withdrawing only when absolutely necessary. O'Kane had pushed his boat and crew beyond normal limits, operating in shallow water where most submarine commanders refused to venture, making surface attacks in broad daylight that conventional doctrine deemed suicidal. Now, with dawn approaching on October 25th, one final target remained. A transport estimated at 7,000 tons, already damaged, struggling to maintain headway. Tang had 2 torpedoes left. 2 Mark 18 electric torpedoes, the newer models that ran without the telltale wake of compressed air weapons. Silent, deadly, and according to the Bureau of Ordnance, perfectly reliable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. O'Kane had fired 22 torpedoes on this patrol, 22 successful shots that had devastated an entire convoy system. But the torpedo that was about to leave Tang's number 24 tube would not find an enemy target. Instead, it would demonstrate that even after 2 years of modifications, improvements, and desperate field repairs, American torpedoes could still kill the wrong people. What happened in the next 4 minutes would sink the most successful submarine of the Pacific War, kill 78 of 87 men aboard, and send the survivors into a nightmare that would test every limit of human endurance. The story of USS Tang's final moments is not just about mechanical failure. It is about the cost of aggressive tactics, the mathematics of probability, and the terrible reality that in war, excellence offers no protection against chance. The nightmare had begun not with this patrol, but with a submarine doctrine that transformed American underwater warfare in 1943 and 44. When Richard Hetherington O'Kane took command of Tang on October 15, 1943, he brought lessons learned from 5 war patrols aboard USS Wahoo under Commander Dudley Morton. Morton's tactics were revolutionary and controversial. He attacked on the surface when possible, using the submarine's superior speed and maneuverability. He penetrated enemy harbors in daylight. He fired from close range, often inside minimum safety distances. He pushed every tactical limit, and he achieved extraordinary results until Wahoo disappeared with all hands in the Malfunctioning Strait on October 11, 1943. O'Kane had absorbed Morton's aggressive philosophy, but he coupled it with methodical calculation. Where Morton relied on instinct and audacity, O'Kane added precision. He studied attack geometry with mathematical rigor. He trained his crew to execute complex maneuvers with split-second timing. He practiced approach angles until every man aboard could visualize torpedo tracks in 3 dimensions. Born in Dover, New Hampshire on February 2, 1910, O'Kane graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1934. He served on the destroyer USS Pruitt before volunteering for submarine duty in 1938. By December 1941, he was executive officer aboard USS Argonaut, then transferred to Wahoo in December 1942 as executive officer under Morton. The partnership between Morton and O'Kane became legendary. Morton commanded, O'Kane calculated firing solutions. Together, they developed tactics that would influence American submarine doctrine for the rest of the war. When Morton took Wahoo into Wewak Harbor, New Guinea in January 1943, attacking Japanese shipping at anchor in broad daylight, O'Kane managed the fire control problem while surface gunners engaged shore batteries. When Wahoo survived that attack and returned with confirmed kills, submarine force commanders took notice. Perhaps the doctrine of cautious, submerged approaches and long-range shots was unnecessarily conservative. Perhaps aggressive commanders willing to take calculated risks could achieve dramatically higher kill rates. O'Kane's first patrol as commanding officer of Tang departed Pearl Harbor on January 22, 1944, bound for the Caroline Islands. The submarine carried 24 Mark 18 electric torpedoes, the weapons that were supposed to solve the problems that had plagued earlier Mark 14 models. No magnetic exploders to fire prematurely. No compressed air wake to reveal the submarine's position. Quieter operation for stealthy approaches. But the Mark 18 had its own problems. The electric motor was temperamental. The battery cells that powered it were prone to flooding. The depth control mechanism was sensitive to temperature variations. And like all American torpedoes, the Mark 18 could suffer from the mechanical defects in the Mark 6 contact exploder that had caused so many failures in the war's first 2 years. Tang's first patrol resulted in 5 confirmed ships sunk, totaling approximately 17,000 tons. O'Kane's tactics were already evident. He closed to point-blank range, often firing from inside 2,000 yards. He made night surface attacks, using radar for initial detection and visual confirmation for firing solutions. He operated in shallow water where enemy destroyers hunting him risked grounding themselves. The second patrol from March 10th to April 30th, 1944, sent another 2 ships to the bottom. The third patrol from June 8th to July 8th produced even more aggressive tactics. Tang penetrated the Yellow Sea, operating in water so shallow that the submarine had only feet of clearance between keel and bottom. When Japanese patrol boats forced Tang deep, O'Kane would settle the boat on the seabed and wait, cruise silent, for the hunters to give up. On this third patrol, O'Kane achieved what he would later describe as his most satisfying attack. On June 24th, Tang tracked a convoy of 6 ships with escorts. Instead of the standard submerge approach from outside the escort screen, O'Kane surfaced after dark and ran at full speed toward the convoy. Tang slipped between 2 escorts, penetrated to the center of the formation, and fired torpedoes at multiple targets simultaneously. The escorts were hunting for a submarine outside their screen, never imagining that the submarine was already among the merchant ships they were protecting. Tang sank 2 transports and 1 tanker before withdrawing at high speed on the surface, leaving confused escorts depth-charging empty water. This third patrol earned O'Kane the Navy Cross, his second. The citation praised his brilliant planning and faultless execution, his ability to press home attacks under the most adverse conditions. But the citation did not mention that O'Kane's tactics violated almost every conventional rule of submarine warfare. He surfaced when he should have remained submerged. He closed to ranges where his own torpedoes endangered his submarine. He operated in water so shallow that a single mistake could mean grounding. The fourth patrol from July 31st to September 3rd, 1944, was Tang's most successful yet. Operating in the East China Sea and Yellow Sea, the submarine sank 10 ships, totaling approximately 39,000 tons. O'Kane's tactics became even more aggressive. He made multiple surface attacks in a single night. He pursued convoys into harbor approaches where patrol boats swarmed. He fired torpedoes from ranges measured in hundreds of yards rather than thousands. By September 1944, Tang had sunk 24 Japanese vessels. The submarine and its captain were becoming famous throughout the submarine force. O'Kane was proving that aggressive tactics produced results. Other submarine commanders began adopting his methods, pushing closer targets, making surface attacks, operating in waters previously considered too dangerous. But success creates its own dangers. Aggressive tactics work when everything functions correctly, when torpedoes run straight, when depth settings are accurate, when contact exploders detonate on impact. When any element fails, aggressive tactics place the submarine in positions where there is no margin for error, no room to evade consequences. Tang's fifth patrol began on September 24, 1944. The submarine departed Pearl Harbor with 24 Mark 18 torpedoes, bound for the Formosa Strait and the East China Sea. The assigned patrol area was among the most dangerous in the Pacific. Japanese air bases on Formosa could cover the strait with constant patrols. Surface escorts were numerous and well-trained. The water was shallow, limiting diving depth and making sonar detection easier. O'Kane welcomed the challenge. Tang's crew had complete confidence in their captain and their boat. They had survived 4 patrols of aggressive operations. They had developed tactics and procedures refined through combat experience. They knew exactly what they could accomplish. The patrol began with frustration. For days, Tang encountered nothing but small coastal vessels and patrol boats, targets not worth precious torpedoes. O'Kane pushed farther west, closer to the Chinese coast, seeking the major convoy routes. On October 10th, radar detected a large convoy, but mechanical problems with Tang's radar prevented accurate tracking. The convoy escaped. On October 23rd, fortune changed. Tang's radar picked up a convoy of approximately 9 ships with 3 escorts, heading south through the Formosa Strait. O'Kane tracked through the afternoon, waiting for darkness. As the sun set, he made his decision. Tang would attack on the surface that night, using speed and maneuverability to penetrate the escort screen. At 2000 hours on October 23rd, Tang began the approach. The submarine ran on the surface at 17 knots, closing rapidly with the convoy. O'Kane worked the plot continuously, calculating courses and speeds, determining optimal firing positions. The convoy was making only 10 knots, meaning Tang could overtake and position anywhere O'Kane chose. At 22:30 hours, Tang reached firing position off the convoy's starboard beam, range approximately 1,000 yards. O'Kane fired 2 torpedoes from the forward tubes. Both ran straight and true. One struck a tanker amidships, the explosion massive and immediate. The second hit a cargo ship, which immediately began settling by the bow. The escorts reacted predictably, turning toward where they thought the attack originated. But Tang was already moving, racing ahead of the convoy at full speed, preparing for another attack from the bow. This was O'Kane's signature tactic. Hit from the beam, race ahead while escorts hunted astern, attack again from the bow before they realized the submarine had repositioned. At 2300 hours, Tang fired 2 more torpedoes from the forward tubes at the lead ships in the convoy. Both hits. Another tanker exploded, flames reaching hundreds of feet into the air. A cargo ship listed heavily, clearly doomed. Now the escorts were confused and aggressive. They knew a submarine was nearby, but Tang's electric torpedoes left no wakes, giving no indication of firing position. The escorts began a systematic search pattern, dropping depth charges randomly, hoping to force the submarine deep or damage it enough to slow it down. O'Kane took Tang deep, but only briefly. The water was too shallow for prolonged submersion. Within minutes, he surfaced again and opened range from the escorts. The convoy was in chaos, ships turning independently, escorts searching frantically. O'Kane set up for another attack. At 0100 hours on October 24th, Tang fired again. 2 torpedoes, 2 more hits. A transport broke apart and sank within minutes. Tang now had 6 confirmed sinking in less than 3 hours. O'Kane's aggressive surface tactics were working perfectly, but the convoy commander was not finished. Instead of scattering as many convoys did after losing multiple ships, this commander rallied the remaining vessels and escorts, forming a tight defensive formation. O'Kane tracked them through the rest of the night, waiting for an opening. Dawn on October 24th forced Tang to submerge. O'Kane spent the daylight hours in shallow water, tracking the convoy by periscope, planning the next attack. The convoy was heading for the Turnabout Island area, moving slowly, clearly damaged. Escorts were still searching, but their patterns suggested exhaustion and low morale. As darkness fell on October 24th, O'Kane surfaced and resumed the hunt. The convoy was barely making 7 knots now, several ships clearly damaged. This would be Tang's final attack on this convoy. After this, O'Kane would need to find new targets or head for the barn with remaining torpedoes. At 2200 hours on October 24th, Tang began the approach for what O'Kane intended as the killing blow. He had 14 torpedoes remaining. He would fire them all if necessary to destroy every ship in this convoy. The mathematics were straightforward. 14 torpedoes, 7 remaining ships, 2 torpedoes per target was overkill. Tang closed at 1,200 yards, an aggressive range even by O'Kane standards. He fired 6 torpedoes in rapid succession from the forward tubes, targeting 3 ships simultaneously. The torpedo room crew worked with practiced efficiency, reloading tubes as fast as mechanical systems allowed. 5 torpedoes hit. 2 transports sank immediately. A third was clearly finished, settling rapidly. 2 more torpedoes missed, running under or past their targets. O'Kane continued the attack. He fired 4 more torpedoes from the stern tubes as Tang turned. 3 hits, 2 more ships destroyed or fatally damaged. Now Tang had 4 torpedoes remaining. For Mark 18 electric torpedoes in the stern tubes. 1 crippled transport was still struggling to maintain headway. Approximately 7,000 tons, already damaged from earlier hits, but stubbornly refusing to sink. O'Kane decided to finish it. He positioned Tang for a classic stern shot, beam to the target, range approximately 800 yards. Close enough to guarantee hits, far enough to allow Tang to maneuver after firing. At 0230 hours on October 25th, O'Kane gave the order. Fire tube 23. The torpedo left the tube normally. The crew felt the familiar surge as compressed air ejected the weapon. Through the periscope, O'Kane watched the torpedo's phosphorescent wake streak toward the target. But something was wrong. The wake wasn't straight. The torpedo ran straight for perhaps 20 seconds, covering about 300 yards. Then it began to curve. Not the gentle arc of a torpedo with improper gyro settings, but a sharp turn. The torpedo was circling, and its turning radius was bringing it back toward Tang. O'Kane later described that moment with clinical precision. The torpedo curved to the right in a death circle and headed directly for the Tang's bow. He ordered emergency flank speed, full left rudder, trying to turn Tang inside the torpedo's turning radius, trying to outrun the weapon that was homing on its launcher. Tang's diesels roared to full power. The submarine heeled over as the rudder took hold, turning hard left. For a few seconds, it seemed possible that Tang might escape. The submarine was accelerating. The torpedo was following a curved path. Perhaps there was enough room, enough time. There wasn't. At 0235 hours, the torpedo struck Tang's stern after the after torpedo room at the junction of the control room and the maneuvering room. The explosion was catastrophic. The Mark 18 warhead contained 336 pounds of high explosive torpex. When it detonated against Tang's pressure hull, it tore through steel plating designed to withstand depth charge near misses, not direct torpedo hits. The pressure hull ruptured. Water flooded into the after compartments with explosive force. Men in the maneuvering room and after torpedo room died instantly, crushed by water pressure or drowned before they could react. The forward part of the submarine remained intact, but Tang was sinking. The stern dropped rapidly as thousands of gallons of seawater poured through the rupture hull. O'Kane ordered all hands forward, trying to concentrate weight in the bow, trying to keep the forward torpedo room and conning tower above water long enough for crew to escape. The submarine's angle increased rapidly. 10 degrees down, 15 degrees, 20 degrees. Equipment broke loose. Men struggled to maintain footing on tilting decks. The main induction valve was open. The submarine had been running on the surface. Now, seawater poured down the induction piping into the diesel engine rooms. O'Kane attempted to blow ballast tanks, forcing compressed air into the tanks to expel water and increase buoyancy. The compressed air system responded, but with the stern completely flooded and the pressure hull breached, it wasn't enough. Tang continued to sink. In less than 1 minute from the torpedo impact, the main deck was awash. In 90 seconds, water reached the conning tower bridge where O'Kane and 8 other men stood. The choice now was brutal and immediate. Stay with the submarine and drown, or abandon ship and take your chances in water surrounded by Japanese patrol boats. O'Kane ordered abandon ship. The men on the bridge jumped or were washed off as Tang plunged beneath the surface. 9 men entered the water. The submarine continued sinking, stern first, the bow rising at an increasingly steep angle until finally the entire vessel slipped beneath the waves. Tang sank in 180 feet of water, coming to rest on the bottom at approximately 0240 hours on October 25, 1944. 78 men were trapped inside, most of them still alive in the forward compartments, sealed in by watertight doors that separated the flooded stern from sections that still held air. What happened next would test every limit of human courage and mechanical ingenuity. The survivors inside Tang faced a choice just as brutal as the one O'Kane faced on the bridge. Stay inside and wait for rescue that might never come, or attempt escape from 180 feet using the Momsen lung, a device that had never been successfully used from that depth in combat conditions. On the surface, O'Kane and 8 other men struggled in the water. Dawn was approaching. Japanese patrol boats were already converging on the area, alerted by the massive explosions. The escort vessels that had been hunting Tang all night finally had definitive proof of where the submarine had been. They would search for survivors, and those survivors would become prisoners. The 5-day chase, 24 enemy vessels sent to the bottom, the most successful single patrol of any American submarine in World War II, ended with Tang's own torpedo circling back, striking its launcher, killing 78 American submariners. The investigation into what caused the torpedo malfunction would reveal problems that extended beyond mechanical failure. The Mark 18 torpedo, like the Mark 14 before it, suffered from defects that had been identified but never fully resolved. The electric propulsion system was vulnerable to battery cell damage. The gyroscope mechanism that controlled direction could jam or malfunction. The depth control system could fail under certain conditions. But more fundamentally, the investigation would reveal that aggressive tactics, while producing higher kill rates, also increased exposure to the statistical probability of torpedo failure. O'Kane had fired 24 torpedoes on this patrol before the fatal shot. With a failure rate even as low as 5%, the mathematics suggested that at least one torpedo would malfunction significantly. The difference was that on this 24th shot, Tang was operating in exactly the position where a circling torpedo could reach its launcher before the submarine could evade. Had the malfunction occurred on an earlier shot when Tang was at longer range, the crew might have had time to maneuver clear. Had it occurred when Tang was deeper, the torpedo might have passed overhead. Instead, it occurred at close range, on the surface, with Tang in the perfect position to be struck by its own weapon. The story of USS Tang's loss is not just about one submarine and one torpedo. It is about the cost of excellence, the mathematics of risk, and the terrible reality that in war, doing everything right offers no guarantee of survival. O'Kane had executed nearly perfect tactics for 5 patrols. He had trained his crew to function with extraordinary precision. He had pushed every tactical advantage, and in the end, probability caught up with perfection. The water temperature in the Formosa Strait on October 25, 1944, was approximately 78 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia, but cold enough that prolonged immersion would eventually incapacitate even the strongest swimmer. Richard O'Kane surfaced gasping, disoriented from the explosion and the sudden immersion, his ears ringing from the detonation that had destroyed his submarine. Around him in the darkness, other men struggled to stay afloat. Yeoman Second Class Floyd Caverly, Motor Machinist Mate First Class William Leibold, Chief Motor Machinist Mate Hayes Truck, Electricians Mate Second Class Clayton Decker, and 4 others whose names O'Kane could not immediately identify in the chaos. 9 men on the surface, 78 trapped below in a submarine resting on the bottom at 180 feet. The mathematics of survival had suddenly become very simple and very terrible. O'Kane's first action was instinctive and professional. He began counting heads, trying to identify who had made it off the bridge. The submarine had submerged so rapidly that men barely had time to react. Some had jumped clear. Others had been washed off by the wave that swept over the conning tower as Tang went under. At least 2 men had been sucked down with the submarine, pulled under by the water rushing into the open conning tower hatch. The immediate danger was not drowning. All the men on the bridge had been wearing life jackets as standard procedure during surface operations. The immediate danger was the Japanese patrol boats that were even now racing toward the area, drawn by the massive explosions and flames from the sinking convoy ships. O'Kane made a decision that probably saved the lives of every man on the surface. He ordered the survivors to remain quiet, to avoid splashing, to present as small a profile as possible in the water. If Japanese patrol boats spotted them immediately, they would be machine-gunned in the water or captured within minutes. If they could remain undetected until dawn, they might have a chance of evading the initial search. The men complied, though it required extraordinary discipline. They were exhausted from days of continuous combat operations. They had just survived an explosion and the sinking of their submarine. Their shipmates were trapped or dead below them, and now they had to float silently in enemy-controlled waters, hoping not to be seen. As the survivors waited in the darkness, the men trapped inside Tang faced their own desperate situation. When the torpedo struck, watertight doors throughout the submarine had been closed or were immediately dogged shut by crew members following emergency procedures. This compartmentalization saved lives in the forward sections but doomed men in the flooded stern. The after torpedo room, the maneuvering room, and the after engine room were completely flooded within seconds. 13 men stationed in those compartments died almost instantly. The forward engine room and the forward torpedo room remained intact, separated from the flooded sections by watertight doors that held against the water pressure. In the forward torpedo room, 30 men were trapped. In the forward engine room and adjoining compartments, another 35 men remained alive. Total of 65 men inside the submarine, breathing air that would not last indefinitely, sitting on the bottom at 180 feet. Lieutenant Howard Walker, the engineering officer, took command inside the submarine. O'Kane and the executive officer were presumed lost, either killed in the explosion or washed overboard. Walker was senior officer present. The responsibility for the 65 trapped men now rested with him. Walker's first action was to assess the situation methodically. He ordered damage reports from all compartments. The news was universally bad. The stern was completely flooded. The pressure hull was breached. The main induction was open, and seawater had flooded the engine rooms partially before crew members managed to close valves and stop the flooding. The submarine's electrical system was failing. Battery compartments were taking water. Emergency lighting was operating on battery power that would last only hours. Most critically, the submarine was resting at 180 feet, far deeper than the rated depth for Momsen lung escapes. The Momsen lung, officially designated the Submarine Escape Appliance, was a rebreathing device invented by Commander Charles Momsen in the 1920s. It allowed submariners to breathe while ascending from a sunken submarine, recycling exhaled carbon dioxide through a chemical scrubber and providing oxygen from a small tank. The device had been tested to 100 feet in controlled conditions. It had been used successfully in several peacetime submarine accidents, most notably during the rescue of 33 men from USS Tang in May 1939. But it had never been used from 180 feet. The pressure at that depth was approximately 80 pounds per square inch. Ascending from that depth required precise control of breathing and ascent rate to avoid nitrogen narcosis, oxygen toxicity, and the bends. Walker knew the statistics. He knew that attempting escape from this depth would likely kill most of the men who tried it. He also knew that staying inside the submarine meant certain death when the air ran out or the batteries failed and the emergency lighting died, leaving them in complete darkness while they suffocated. He made the decision to attempt escape. The alternative was waiting to die. At least escape offered a chance, however slim. Walker organized the men in the forward torpedo room into groups. The Momsen lungs were stored in the compartment, one for each man aboard. The escape procedure required flooding the torpedo room slowly, equalizing pressure with the sea outside, then opening the forward torpedo loading hatch and allowing men to ascend individually. The procedure was dangerous even in ideal conditions. At 180 feet, it was nearly suicidal, but it was the only option available. The first problem was psychological. The men would have to wait while the compartment flooded, watching water rise around them, feeling pressure increase in their ears and sinuses, knowing that if anything went wrong with the hatch mechanism, they would all drown trapped in a flooded compartment. Walker explained the procedure calmly and methodically. The flooding would be controlled using the submarine's compressed air system and ballast controls. As water entered, pressure inside the compartment would increase until it matched the 80 pounds per square inch outside. Then the hatch could be opened. Men would exit one at a time, ascending slowly, breathing through the Momsen lung, exhaling continuously to prevent lung overexpansion as pressure decreased during ascent. The men listened in silence. They knew the risks. They also knew these were the orders, and following orders was what submariners did even when the orders meant swimming up through 180 feet of black water with a device that probably wouldn't work. The first group entered the forward torpedo room at approximately 0400 hours, roughly 90 minutes after Tang sank. 8 men, wearing Momsen lungs, prepared for escape. The flooding began. Water entered through control valves. The level rose slowly, inches at first, then faster as more valves were opened. The men stood on the torpedo racks as water rose around them. Knee deep, waist deep, chest deep. The pressure increased. Ears popped painfully. Some men's sinuses began bleeding from the pressure change. The air they were breathing became denser, harder to inhale, compressed to a quarter of its normal volume. When water reached the overhead, the compartment was completely flooded. Pressure was equalized. In theory, the hatch could now be opened without being blown off by pressure differential. Lieutenant J.D. Campbell, the first to attempt escape, positioned himself under the hatch. He released the locking mechanism and pushed upward. The hatch opened. Water pressure had been correctly equalized. Campbell pulled himself through the opening and began ascending. The men waiting inside watched his bubbles rise toward the surface. Then the second man went through. Then the third. Of the 8 men in that first group, 5 reached the surface alive. 3 died during the ascent, either from lung overexpansion, nitrogen narcosis, or simply drowning when they panicked and breathed water instead of continuing to use the Momsen lung correctly. 5 out of 8 was better odds than Walker had expected. He organized the second group. 8 more men flooded the compartment and attempted escape. 6 reached the surface. The survival rate was improving as men learned from watching the first group's mistakes. Through the morning hours of October 25th, groups of submariners flooded the forward torpedo room and attempted the ascent. Each group waited while the compartment was drained and re-flooded, a time-consuming process that used precious compressed air reserves. Each group watched their predecessors ascend, trying to learn what worked and what didn't. By 0800 hours, 13 men had reached the surface alive from the forward torpedo room. But the escape attempts had exhausted the compressed air supply needed to blow ballast tanks and drain the compartment. The remaining men in the forward torpedo room, approximately 17 men, were trapped. There was no longer enough air pressure to complete the flooding and draining cycle. Those 17 men made the decision to wait, hoping for rescue, knowing that rescue was unlikely. The air in their compartment would last perhaps 12 more hours. If rescue didn't come by then, they would suffocate. In the forward engine room and adjoining compartments, 35 men faced the same calculation. They had no escape trunk, no way to flood their compartments in a controlled manner. Their only option was to wait or to attempt individual escapes through emergency hatches, a procedure that was even more dangerous than the controlled escape from the torpedo room. 4 men attempted individual escapes from the forward engine room. 1 reached the surface. 3 died in the attempt. The remaining 31 men in the after sections of the submarine made the decision to wait inside, conserving oxygen, hoping for rescue. On the surface, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Dawn arrived at approximately 0600 hours on October 25th. With daylight came visibility, and with visibility came the certainty of discovery. Japanese patrol boats systematically searched the area where Tang had sunk. Debris floated on the surface. Oil slicks marked the submarine's grave, and now men were appearing in the water. Submariners ascending from 180 feet, many of them unconscious or disoriented from the bends. The first Japanese patrol boat spotted survivors at approximately 0700 hours. The reaction was exactly what O'Kane had feared. Machine gun fire raked the water, killing at least 2 American submariners before officers on the patrol boat ordered the firing stopped. The Japanese needed prisoners for intelligence purposes. Dead men revealed nothing. Motor machinist mate Jesse De Silva, who had successfully escaped from the forward torpedo room, was machine-gunned in the water and killed. Torpedo man's mate second-class John Hubeck was also killed by machine gun fire. The Japanese patrol boat then began recovering survivors, pulling exhausted submariners from the water at gunpoint. O'Kane and the men who had been on the bridge when Tang sank had managed to evade detection through the night by remaining absolutely still in the water. But with dawn and the appearance of more survivors ascending from the submarine, concealment became impossible. At approximately 0730 hours, a Japanese patrol boat spotted O'Kane's group and moved to recover them. The Japanese sailors who pulled O'Kane from the water did not immediately recognize that they had captured the commanding officer of the submarine. O'Kane was wearing standard dungarees with no rank insignia. He looked no different from any other exhausted submariner. The Japanese questioned survivors briefly, trying to determine how many men had been aboard, how many might still be trapped below. O'Kane refused to provide any information beyond name, rank, and serial number, as required by the Geneva Convention. The Japanese patrol boat crew did not press the issue at that moment. There would be time for interrogation later. For now, they focused on recovering survivors. By 0900 hours, the Japanese had recovered 15 men from the water, 9 from the bridge, including O'Kane, plus 6 who had successfully escaped from the forward torpedo room. 8 more men were spotted floating face down, dead from the bends, from drowning, or from machine gun fire. The Japanese patrol boats did not recover the bodies. Inside Tang, the remaining men waited. The submarine rested at an angle, stern down at 180 feet, bow at approximately 160 feet. The air was becoming foul, thick with carbon dioxide. Men were instructed to remain still, to minimize oxygen consumption, to breathe slowly and shallowly. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Emergency lighting failed at approximately 1000 hours. The forward compartments went completely dark. Men sat in pitch blackness, listening to each other breathe, waiting for rescue that was not coming, trying not to think about the slow suffocation that awaited them. Chief pharmacist Mate Hayes Truck, who had been on the bridge and was now a prisoner aboard a Japanese patrol boat, later reported that he could see oil bubbles continuing to rise from Tang's position throughout the morning of October 25th. This indicated that men inside were still alive, still moving, disturbing fuel oil trapped inside the submarine. The bubbles continued until approximately 1400 hours. Then they stopped. The men trapped inside Tang, those who had not attempted escape, those who had waited for rescue, had exhausted their oxygen supply. 48 men died inside the submarine. Combined with the 13 killed instantly in the explosion, the 2 killed on the surface, and the 8 who died attempting escape, Tang's final casualty count was 71 dead out of 87 men aboard. The 16 survivors were now prisoners of war. They were transferred to a Japanese destroyer and taken to Formosa for initial interrogation. The interrogations were brutal. Japanese intelligence officers wanted information about American submarine operations, about patrol areas, about tactics and capabilities. The submariners, following their training and the requirements of the Geneva Convention, refused to provide any information beyond identifying themselves. The interrogators increased pressure. Sleep deprivation, beatings, threats of execution. O'Kane was singled out for particularly harsh treatment once the Japanese realized they had captured a submarine commander. He was interrogated repeatedly, sometimes for hours at a time, questioned about American submarine doctrine, about torpedo technology, about communications procedures. O'Kane later stated that the only reason he survived these interrogations was that he genuinely could not provide information the Japanese wanted. He did not know patrol areas assigned to other submarines. He did not know details of torpedo manufacturing beyond what any submarine officer would know from using the weapons. He could not reveal American codes because submarine commanders did not have access to the cryptographic systems used by fleet headquarters. After 2 weeks in Formosa, the survivors were transported to Japan. They arrived at Ofuna Interrogation Camp on November 9, 1944. Ofuna was not a standard prisoner of war camp. It was an intelligence gathering center where the Japanese held Allied prisoners who possessed valuable information. Conditions at Ofuna were deliberately harsh, designed to break prisoners' resistance to interrogation. Prisoners at Ofuna received approximately 600 calories per day, roughly 1/4 of the minimum needed to sustain an adult male. They were forbidden to speak to each other. They were subjected to regular beatings for infractions of camp rules that were deliberately vague and arbitrarily enforced. They received no medical care for injuries or illnesses. O'Kane and his men were held at Ofuna until March 1945. For 4 months, they endured interrogation, starvation, and systematic brutality. Several of the Tang survivors developed beriberi from vitamin deficiency. Others suffered from dysentery. Chief Motor Machinist Mate Hayes' truck developed severe dental problems from malnutrition, losing multiple teeth. In March 1945, as American forces approached Japan and strategic bombing increased, the Japanese transferred most Ofuna prisoners to standard POW camps. O'Kane and the Tang survivors were sent to Amori prison camp near Tokyo. Conditions at Amori were marginally better than Ofuna. Prisoners received slightly more food, were allowed to communicate with each other, and were subject to Geneva Convention protections, at least nominally. But Amori was located in an industrial area that was a primary target for American B-29 bombing raids. Throughout the spring and summer of 1945, the prisoners endured regular bombing attacks. The psychological impact of being bombed by their own forces, of knowing that any raid might kill them, added another layer of stress to men already weakened by months of imprisonment. O'Kane later described watching B-29s drop incendiary bombs on Tokyo, seeing the city burn, knowing that hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians were dying in those fires, and feeling no satisfaction, only horror at the scale of destruction. The war had long since stopped being about tactics and strategy for him. It had become about survival, about lasting one more day, about seeing one more sunrise. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The prisoners at Amori did not immediately believe the news. They had been told lies before, propaganda designed to break their morale. But within days, American aircraft began dropping supplies to the camp. Food, medicine, clothing. The war was genuinely over. American forces reached Amori on August 29, 1945. O'Kane and the Tang survivors were evacuated immediately, transported to Yokohama for medical evaluation, then flown to Guam and finally to Pearl Harbor. They arrived in Hawaii on September 18, 1945, nearly 11 months after Tang sank. Of the 16 survivors recovered from the water on October 25, 1944, all 16 survived imprisonment and returned to the United States. This survival rate was remarkable. Approximately 40% of American prisoners held by Japan died in captivity from starvation, disease, execution, or Allied bombing. The Tang survivors' military training, their physical conditioning before capture, and perhaps most importantly their sense of group cohesion, helped them endure conditions that killed many other prisoners. O'Kane weighed 141 pounds when liberated. He had weighed 178 pounds when Tang deployed on her final patrol. He had lost 37 pounds, roughly 21% of his body weight. Other survivors showed similar weight loss. Several required extended hospitalization for malnutrition-related illnesses. The investigation into Tang's loss began immediately upon the survivors' return. The Navy needed to understand what had happened, both to prevent similar losses and to determine if equipment modifications were needed. O'Kane provided detailed testimony about the final moments. He described the torpedo launch, the circular run, the impact, the sinking. He stated unequivocally that the torpedo had malfunctioned, that it had not been a firing error or navigational mistake. The Bureau of Ordnance conducted its own investigation. They examined maintenance record for the torpedoes loaded aboard Tang for a fifth patrol. They reviewed the Mark 18 torpedo's design specifications. They compiled reports of other circular runs and erratic torpedo behavior from other submarines. What they found was disturbing but not surprising to anyone who had been following American torpedo development through the war. The Mark 18 electric torpedo, despite being newer than the Mark 14, suffered from its own set of problems. The most critical was the gyroscope mechanism that controlled the torpedo's direction. The gyroscope was powered by the same battery system that drove the torpedo's propulsion motor. If individual battery cells failed or flooded, the electrical system could malfunction. The gyroscope might receive incorrect voltage, causing it to provide false steering commands. The torpedo would then turn, following the erroneous gyro signals rather than running straight. Additionally, the Mark 18's depth control mechanism was sensitive to temperature and pressure variations. If the torpedo ran deeper than its set depth, increased water pressure could affect the control mechanism, causing the torpedo to porpoise or turn. If battery heating caused thermal expansion of components, mechanical tolerances could change enough to affect steering. The Bureau's investigation concluded that Tang's final torpedo had likely suffered a combination of battery cell failure and gyroscope malfunction. The exact sequence could not be determined because the torpedo, unlike the submarine, was never recovered. But the evidence from O'Kane's testimony and from reports of other circular runs suggested a pattern of electrical system failures in Mark 18 torpedoes. The Navy's response was to implement additional quality control measures in torpedo manufacturing. Battery cells were subjected to more rigorous testing before installation. Gyroscope mechanisms were calibrated more carefully. Temperature tolerance specifications were tightened. But fundamentally, the Mark 18 remained an electric torpedo with all the inherent vulnerabilities that electrical systems have when immersed in seawater under high pressure. The broader question that the Navy did not formally investigate was whether O'Kane's aggressive tactics had contributed to the loss. By firing from 800 yards at a crippled target, O'Kane had placed Tang within the turning radius of a malfunctioning torpedo. Had he fired from 2,000 yards, the standard range for most submarine commanders, a circular run would likely have exhausted the torpedo's fuel before it could reach Tang. But criticizing O'Kane's tactics would have been difficult and controversial. Those same tactics had sunk 24 enemy vessels on Tang's fifth patrol alone. Over 5 war patrols, Tang had sunk 33 confirmed ships, totaling approximately 116,000 tons, making her the most successful American submarine of World War II by total tonnage. O'Kane's aggressive approach had proven extraordinarily effective. The Navy's conclusion, never formally stated but evident in post-war doctrine, was that aggressive tactics were necessary and desirable, but that torpedo reliability needed to improve to match the tactics. Commanders should not have to factor in the possibility that their weapons might circle back and kill them. Weapons should work, period. On December 8, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented Richard O'Kane with the Medal of Honor for his actions during Tang's 4th and 5th patrols. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It detailed his successful attacks, his aggressive tactics, and his leadership during Tang's final patrol. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place at the White House. O'Kane stood at attention in dress uniform, 40 pounds heavier than he had been 3 months earlier, but still visibly affected by his imprisonment. Truman pinned the medal on O'Kane's uniform and shook his hand. The president later said that O'Kane was one of the most remarkable officers he had met, a man who had survived the worst that war could inflict and remained unbroken. O'Kane's Medal of Honor was one of 7 awarded to submarine commanders during World War II. It was the only one awarded to a commander who survived his final patrol. The other 6 were awarded posthumously to commanders who went down with their submarines. After the war, O'Kane remained in the Navy. He served in various staff positions, taught at the Naval War College, and worked on submarine doctrine development. He never returned to sea. Duty aboard submarines. The Navy, recognizing the psychological impact of his imprisonment, assigned him to shore billets where his experience could be used for training and doctrine without requiring him to dive again in a submarine. O'Kane retired from the Navy as a Rear Admiral in 1957. He moved to California and lived quietly for the next 2 decades. He rarely gave interviews about his wartime experiences. When he did speak about Tang, he focused on the men who died rather than his own survival and Medal of Honor. In 1977, O'Kane published his memoir, Clear the Bridge, War Patrols of the USS Tang. The book provided detailed accounts of Tang's 5 patrols, described the tactics O'Kane developed, and paid tribute to the crew who executed those tactics with extraordinary skill. The book also described, with clinical precision, the torpedo malfunction that sank Tang and the subsequent imprisonment. O'Kane's description of the circular run remained consistent across all his accounts. The torpedo ran straight initially, then turned sharply to the right, completing approximately a 180-degree arc before striking Tang's stern. The turn was not gradual, but abrupt, suggesting a sudden mechanical or electrical failure rather than a slowly developing problem. This detail was important for post-war torpedo development. Gradual turning could result from improper gyro settings or manufacturing tolerances. Abrupt turning indicated catastrophic component failure. The Navy needed to identify which failure mode had occurred to implement proper corrections. The Mark 18 torpedo remained in service through the end of World War II, but was phased out shortly afterward. By 1948, the Navy had developed new electric torpedoes with improved reliability. The Mark 18's problems with battery flooding, gyroscope malfunctions, and circular runs made it unsuitable for peacetime service where training exercises could not risk losing submarines to friendly fire. The men who died aboard Tang were not forgotten. The Navy held memorial services at Pearl Harbor and at submarine bases across the United States. The Tang crew was honored for their extraordinary combat record and for their sacrifice. Of the 71 men who died, most have no grave. They remain entombed inside Tang, resting at 180 feet in the Formosa Strait. The 16 survivors maintained contact throughout their lives. They held regular reunions, gathered to remember their shipmates, and supported each other through the decades after the war. The shared experience of Tang's sinking, the escape attempts, the imprisonment, and the survival created bonds that lasted until the men died. Hayes Truck, the chief pharmacist's mate who was on the bridge with O'Kane, lived until 1986. He gave numerous interviews about Tang's loss and about his imprisonment. He consistently stated that O'Kane's leadership during the imprisonment, his refusal to break under interrogation, and his insistence that all survivors support each other, was as important as his tactical brilliance during the patrols. William Leibold, motor machinist mate first class, lived until 2009. He was the last surviving officer from Tang's bridge. In his final interviews, he described the moment of the torpedo impact with the same precision O'Kane used. The explosion, the immediate flooding, the rapid sinking, the desperate scramble to escape the bridge before Tang went under. Floyd Caverly, yeoman second class, described the night in the water waiting for dawn, knowing that Japanese patrol boats were searching, trying to remain silent despite exhaustion and fear. He stated that O'Kane's order to remain quiet and minimize splashing probably saved every man on the surface. Had they been splashing and calling out to each other, they would have been detected immediately and likely killed. The 5 men who successfully escaped from the forward torpedo room never spoke publicly about their experience in detail. The escape from 180 feet was so traumatic, so close to death, that they preferred not to revisit it. But in private conversations with Navy investigators, they provided crucial information about the Malfunctioning's performance at extreme depth. Their testimony led to improvements in submarine escape training and equipment. The Navy developed new escape procedures for deep depths. They improved the Malfunctioning design, though it was eventually replaced by the Stanky hood and later by submarine escape immersion equipment. The escape technology evolved, but the fundamental principle remained the same. Men trapped in sunken submarines needed a way to reach the surface, and that way had to work under the worst possible conditions. Tang's wreck remained undiscovered for 66 years. Various attempts to locate the submarine failed due to imprecise coordinates and difficult search conditions. Finally, in 2010, a joint American-Taiwanese expedition using side-scan sonar located Tang's wreck in the Formosa Strait. The submarine rests upright on the seabed. Stern section collapsed from the torpedo explosion. Bow section relatively intact. No attempt has been made to recover artifacts or remains from the wreck. Tang is a war grave, protected under international law. The 71 men entombed inside remain where they fell, 180 feet down in the strait they fought to control. Richard O'Kane died on February 16, 1994 at age 83. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 59, Site 714, alongside America's other war heroes. His grave marker identifies him as Rear Admiral Richard H. O'Kane, Medal of Honor, USS Tang. The inscription is simple, dignified, and entirely inadequate to capture what he accomplished and endured. O'Kane's legacy extends beyond his Medal of Honor and his submarine's combat record. He proved that aggressive submarine tactics could achieve extraordinary results. He developed fire control techniques that became standard doctrine. He trained crews to function with precision under extreme stress. And he demonstrated that leadership means taking responsibility for your men's lives, making decisions based on calculated risk rather than fear, and accepting the consequences when fortune turns against you. The final torpedo that sank Tang was officially recorded as a Mark 18 serial number unknown. The torpedo left no recovery debris, no pieces that could be examined to determine exact failure mode. It simply malfunctioned, circled back, and destroyed the submarine that launched it. In the chaos of that night, with multiple targets burning and escorts searching, one malfunctioning torpedo found the one target it should never have hit. The probability mathematics are interesting in hindsight. O'Kane fired 24 torpedoes on Tang's fifth patrol. Even with a malfunction rate as low as 5%, the probability of at least one significant malfunction was approximately 70%. The probability that the one malfunction would occur at exactly the moment when Tang was positioned within the torpedo's turning radius, at exactly the range where evasion was impossible, was much lower. Perhaps 5% of 5, 1 in 400. But probability doesn't care about tactics or skill or experience. Probability is simply mathematics, and mathematics eventually catches everyone. O'Kane's luck held for 23 torpedoes. On the 24th, probability claimed its due. The lesson the Navy learned from Tang's loss was not to abandon aggressive tactics. The lesson was that weapons must be reliable enough to match the tactics. If submarine commanders are going to fire from 800 yards to guarantee hits, then torpedoes must not circle back. If they're going to operate in shallow water to get close to convoys, then depth control mechanisms must work perfectly. If they're going to make multiple attacks in a single night, then every torpedo must run straight and true. The alternative, going back to cautious long-range attack from outside escort screens, would reduce the risk of losses to friendly fire, but would also reduce the effectiveness of the submarine force. The mathematics worked in favor of aggressive tactics, even accounting for occasional losses like Tang. 33 ships sunk at the cost of one submarine was an exchange ratio that won wars. But for the families of the 71 men who died aboard Tang, the mathematics offered no comfort. Their sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers had not died fighting the enemy. They had died because a mechanical device malfunctioned, because probability caught up with tactics, because the torpedo that left Tube 24 on October 25, 1944, turned right instead of running straight. The families received the standard notification. The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your son is missing in action in the Pacific Theater. They received the standard letter from the Secretary of the Navy. He gave his life in service to his country. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. What they did not receive, what the Navy could not provide, was an explanation that made sense of the loss. How do you explain that a submarine commander who had sunk 33 enemy ships, who had survived 5 combat patrols, who had executed nearly flawless tactics, was killed by his own torpedo? How do you explain that doing everything right still wasn't enough? The Navy never fully answered those questions because they were unanswerable. War is not fair. Combat is not predictable. Technology fails at the worst possible moments. And sometimes the men who fight with the most skill and courage still die, not because they made mistakes, but because probability is relentless and indifferent. USS Tang SS 306 received the Presidential Unit Citation for her 5th war patrol. The citation praised the crew's heroic achievement in penetrating enemy-controlled waters and destroying Japanese shipping. It noted that Tang's aggressive attacks had been conducted with exceptional skill and determination. It stated that the submarine's performance reflected the highest credit upon the United States Naval Service. The citation did not mention how Tang was lost. Official records stated only that the submarine was sunk in action against enemy forces on October 25, 1944. The specific detail that Tang was sunk by her own torpedo was classified information, not to be disclosed publicly. The Navy feared that revealing the loss would damage morale, would raise questions about torpedo reliability that had supposedly been resolved after the Bureau of Ordnance scandals of 1942 and 1943. The truth eventually emerged, as truth usually does. O'Kane's memoir published in 1977 detailed exactly what happened. By then, 32 years after the war ended, the Navy no longer attempted to suppress the information. The torpedo problems were historical fact, documented in official reports and academic studies. There was no longer any reason to hide how Tang was lost. But for 3 decades, the families of Tang's crew were told only that their loved ones had died in action against the enemy. They were not told that the enemy was a malfunctioning American torpedo. They were not told that 71 men died because a gyroscope jammed or a battery cell flooded or an electrical connection failed. This deception, however well-intentioned, denied the families closure. They could not honor their dead properly without knowing how they died. They could not demand accountability from the Bureau of Ordnance without knowing that a defective weapon had killed their loved ones. They could only accept the standard story, trust that the Navy was telling the truth, and mourn their loss. When O'Kane finally revealed the full story in his memoir, some families expressed anger at the 3-decade delay. Others felt vindicated that their suspicions of official deception had been correct. A few simply felt relief that they finally knew the truth, however painful that truth might be. The 16 survivors attended every reunion, every memorial service, every ceremony honoring Tang and her crew. They carried the burden of survival, the knowledge that they had lived while their shipmates died, the persistent question of why they had been spared. Survivor's guilt is a recognized psychological condition, one that affects combat veterans particularly severely. O'Kane dealt with his survival by dedicating his post-war career to submarine safety and tactics. He ensured that the lessons learned from Tang's loss were incorporated into training. He pushed for improved torpedo reliability. He advocated for better escape equipment. He turned his survival into purpose, using his experience to protect future submariners from similar fates. The other survivors dealt with their experience in various ways. Some spoke publicly about Tang, keeping their shipmates' memory alive. Others remained silent, finding that talking about the loss only made the pain worse. Several struggled with nightmares and post-traumatic stress, conditions that were not well understood or treated in the 1940s and 50s. Hayes Truck became an advocate for prisoner of war issues, working with veterans organizations to ensure that former POWs received proper medical care and benefits. His experience at Ofuna and Amori had shown him how brutal imprisonment could be and how many former prisoners struggled with physical and psychological after-effects decades after liberation. William Leibold returned to civilian life and rarely spoke about his wartime service. When interviewed in his later years, he consistently stated that he was simply a sailor who did his duty, that he wasn't a hero, that the real heroes were the men who died aboard Tang. This modesty was characteristic of many World War II veterans, men who had seen terrible things and survived but refused to claim special recognition. The mythology that grew up around Tang and O'Kane